Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. I'm Doug Campbell, an assistant professor of philosophy at Alma College in Michigan, and also the host of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast, which is the podcast that explores important topics in ancient philosophy, whether that's in ancient Greece or India or China or the Near East or beyond. Today's episode is going to be an exploration of Aristotle's theory of the soul, which he develops chiefly in De Anima, which means on the soul or concerning the soul. And we're going to explore what the soul is in general for Aristotle, and then a few related topics, such as could Aristotle's view lend itself to belief in the afterlife, and so on. Aristotle's view of the soul is deeply connected to other parts of his philosophy, chiefly the view that we call hylomorphism. Again, that's hylomorphism. That's hylo, like Hylo morphism. That's a term that, unless you've done ancient philosophy before, you've probably never heard of. Hylomorphism is a compound of two ancient Greek words, hule and morphe. Hule means matter, or at least does so in Aristotle's technical vocabulary, and morphe means something like form or shape or structure. You put the two together, hylomorphism, and you end up with a word that means something like matter hyphen formism, matter hyphen formism. And that kind of, I mean, that doesn't capture the whole view, of course, because we haven't really said anything about matter or form, but it tells you that in some way, Aristotle's theorizing as a philosopher is going to involve, in a really big way, these two ideas, matter and form. To say that Aristotle is a hylomorphist is to say something like Aristotle prefers to analyze things as compounds of matter and form. That means that he wants to analyze objects as things that are combinations of matter and form. And the reason why this matters is that we're going to see that the soul for Aristotle is a form and the matter is our body. So again, let me repeat that. The reason why hylomorphism is something we have to address and have to talk about is that Aristotle thinks that the soul is the form and the matter is our body. So we should say something about what these terms are. So matter is that of which something is made, or that of which something is composed. It would be super easy to come up with all sorts of examples of this. The bricks are the matter of a brick house. The bronze is the matter of a bronze statue. Your organic tissue is the matter of your organs, and so on. The the ice cream is the matter of an ice cream sundae. There are expanded or extended uses of the word matter in Aristotle that show you just how broad this concept is supposed to be. So, for example, the premises and conclusion are the matter of an argument. The citizens are the matter of a state, and so on and so forth. But matter generally is that of which something is made. And in contrast, the form is the structure or the arrangement of the matter. So the form is the structure or the arrangement of the matter. So a brick wall is distinct from a brick house because the bricks are arranged like a wall in a brick wall, and they're arranged like a house in a brick house. A bronze statue of me is different from a bronze statue of a dog because the one is shaped like a human and the other is shaped like a dog, and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, the form is important because if you ignored the existence of the form, then you would miss what makes a bronze statue of a dog different from a bronze statue of a cat. They're made of the same matter, bronze, but they are made of they're made according to different forms, made according to different forms, which is why they're distinct things to begin with. So when we understand this, we realize that Aristotle ultimately wants to understand the property something has in terms of the arrangements of its parts or its matter. So when we say, for example, that this bronze statue is really, really, really ugly, we would be talking about the way that it's shaped. And if you compared it to a bronze statue that was really, really, really beautiful, you would explain why by talking about its shape or structure. So the bronze statue that's ugly has its properties explained in terms of the combination of its matter and its form. And then when you are talking about the bronze statue that's really beautiful, you're explaining its property in terms of matter and form. So ultimately, Aristotle is going to explain why things are the way they are in terms of combinations of form and matter. This is why we talk about Aristotle as a hylomorphist, because he's understanding things as um, uh, as compounds of matter and form. Now, again, if you denied the existence of form, that would be tantamount to denying the existence of the arrangements of parts. And so that just doesn't really make sense. You'd be overlooking, again, what makes a brick wall different from a brick house. It's not the brick, right? It's not the bricks. It's the form, the arrangement. Now, on the other hand, it would be foolish, even more foolish in a way, because the foolishness of this is just plain on the face of it. It would be foolish to deny the matter. You can't have form that exists separately from matter. You just can't do it. You can't have, you could imagine the blueprint of a house, the shape of a house, but you can't have a form of a house just being around. You have to have that form instantiated in something. You have to have that form exhibited in something or existing in something. The reason why this is so important is that Aristotle believes that the form of a living body is the soul, that the souls are forms of living bodies. Now, that's why Aristotle applies his hylomorphism to the question of what is the soul? What is the soul? Because Aristotle believes that souls are forms of living bodies. Now, where is he coming from with this? What is he doing? Well, the point is that Aristotle's drawing on a larger tradition that believes that the difference between ensouled things and unensouled things or disensouled things, things that don't have souls, soulless things, the difference between them is life, living, animation, being animate. Again, what makes soulless things different from ensouled things is the presence of life. So Aristotle believes that when we're talking about living things, we should group everything that's alive into one category: plants, animals, humans, and so on, anything that we might consider alive. And we're going to ultimately say these are the things that have a soul. Now, Aristotle is not assuming at all that when we're talking about having a soul because you're alive, he's not assuming that he's talking about an immaterial thing. He's not assuming the existence of an afterlife. He's just explaining what is the difference between living things and non-living things. Namely, that living things have a soul and inanimate or not living things have no soul. And so, again, we don't want to attribute to Aristotle something really controversial like that there's an afterlife that maybe even souls, that maybe even plants have, right? We're not going to attribute that to Aristotle. Aristotle believes that when we're talking about the soul of something, we are talking about its form such that its body is put together in the right way that causes it to be alive. That's why I began by talking about the hylomorphism, because just as the form of a brick house is its shape of a house, and that's what makes it different from a brick wall, it's the same material put together in a different way. Aristotle believes that souls are the arrangements of bodies. They're the sort of bodies that have life potentially, right? So when I say that, and that's Aristotle's phrase, that the soul is the form of a body that has life potentially. What we mean is that we're talking about a body that has a certain level of complexity, has a certain kind of structure and a certain level of complexity. We can't, for example, be picking up a book and say, yeah, this book could be alive. It just needs a soul. Like at some level, that's true because souls are the thing that if this thing had it, it would be alive. But at a deeper, more precise level, souls can really only belong to bodies of a certain kind of complexity and a certain kind of structure. Um, and the consequence of that is that only some bodies can really be potentially alive, and therefore only some bodies can really have souls. If you prefer examples or analogies, you can say like, yeah, like in theory, we could all imagine the form of a house, right? The form of a house, irrespective of the matter. In reality, though, it takes a certain kind of matter to instantiate a house. Obviously, obviously, a house needs matter in general. It needs matter. You can't have just the shape of a house floating freely of any matter, even though we could imagine a form of a house. In reality, we don't stumble across a form of a house. We stumble across a house, which is a compound of matter and form. But not just any old matter will do. Not just any old matter will do. We can't build a house out of honey. We can, however, build a house out of bricks. Similarly, it takes a certain kind of body to be alive, and therefore souls are forms of specific kinds of bodies, and thus we end up with Aristotle's formulation that a soul is a form of a body that has life potentially in it. But the word potentiality or potentially is a crucial one because the soul, when it's actually present, will make a body be actually alive, not just potentially alive. So we can say something like the soul is the actuality, right, that's making the body be alive. In order for a body to have a soul or to come to have a soul, it's got to be a body that potentially has life in it. But when the soul actually is present, the body is actually alive. The body is actually alive. So for that, in that reason, we can talk about a soul being a kind of actuality. It's the sort of actuality of life. You actually are alive when you have a soul. Now, Aristotle distinguishes between two kinds of actuality, which we're going to call first and second actuality because that's what Aristotle calls them. So, what's the difference between first and second actuality? So, it's probably best to give an example first. So Aristotle's example of a first actuality is knowledge. And then Aristotle's example of a second actuality is when you're contemplating something that you know. So the difference between a first and second actuality at the level of definitions is that a first actuality is a capacity that you currently actually possess, but you're not activating. Again, a first actuality is a capacity you actually possess, but you're not activating. A second actuality, in contrast, is the activated capacity. Okay? The activated capacity. So right now, I know how to spell words. I'm literate in that way. I can spell words. That means I have a first actuality being able to spell words. Now, if I'm actually writing down the words and spelling them, then I've got a second actuality. And surely we could think of other examples. I have a first actuality. I can eat. I have the capacity for eating. But there are times when I'm actually eating, and that's when I have the second actuality. Either one is a form of actuality, but again, one is a capacity I actually possess, and the second is the capacity being activated. These are both in contrast to what we might call our potentiality. Now, there are when a newborn baby is just come into the world, that baby doesn't know how to spell, but the baby can develop that capacity. So the baby can develop the capacity, and that would be developing the first actuality. Then when the baby's spelling, the baby is actually putting that capacity into practice and therefore is it would have a second actuality. But when the newborn baby is just born, the newborn baby has merely the potentiality, right? And again, we could give tons of examples. That newborn baby is potentially an instrument player. Then that baby gets taught to play the guitar. One day, when they're older, they have the first actuality. They can play the instrument. They can play it. When they actually are playing it, they've got a second actuality. Aristotle thinks the soul is the first actuality because when we have a soul, we get a package of capacities. A package of capacities. These capacities are things like nutrition, which is just like a baseline level that belongs to all living things, whether we're talking about plant souls or animal souls or human souls. And then there are more sophisticated capacities depending on the level of complexity of the living thing in question, right? Animals, for example, have perception, plants don't. So animals get a perceptual set of capacities. So that would be capacity to see, capacity to taste, and so on. Humans, we have an even greater level of complexity. So we get to think too. We are capable of a certain level of reasoning, intellectual activity that animals just aren't capable of. But still, all living things, plants, animals, and humans, we all have some capacities in common, such as nutrition, and that's due to the soul, which is the first actuality of a living thing. The first actuality of a living thing. One of the things that you might have clued into by now is that Aristotle's view doesn't really make sense of the possibility of an afterlife. Specifically, it says that there's no real way our soul could survive without our body. And that's a very important part of Aristotle's theory of the soul because he's denying something that his teacher Plato believed very, very strongly. And in fact, Plato, one of his most famous theories was the theory of the immortality of the soul. It was so important to Plato, in fact, that he gave roughly 6 different arguments for the immortality of the soul, 4 in the Phaedo, 1 in the Republic, and 1 in the Phaedrus. And it's important. The immortality of the soul is important even in dialogues where Plato doesn't outright argue for it either, such as in the Laws. And Aristotle's denying that. Now, Aristotle denies it because he thinks that when you understand what a soul is, you'll realize that when you're explaining the soul, you're really explaining life, and we should explain life in terms of the arrangements of a body, arrangements of a body or of a body's parts. This view explains death really well, right? It explains why we die. The parts of our body no longer function in the way that they're supposed to, and therefore they enter into the wrong relationship with each other. Similarly, Aristotle's view explains why some things just can't possibly come to be alive, like books, for example. There has to be a really tight match between a soul and a body, just like between a form and matter. After all, again, you can't have forms existing separately of matter. And you also can't have some forms be instantiated in just any old matter, right? You can't build a house out of honey. You can't build a book out of honey. Okay? You can't build a book out of sand. You can't build. There are just some things that we can't eat. For instance, we just can't build a meal out of just any old thing. And that's because Aristotle's hylomorphism, again, tries to explain things that we encounter in the world, such as books and houses, and apparently even living things in terms of compounds of matter and form. But moreover, we have to understand the matter and form of having a very close relationship. So Aristotle's rejecting the Platonic view that we might call dualism, which is the view that the soul and the body are actually just totally independent things, and they just come together for a short time during which living things are alive. But the soul actually predates the existence of the body. For Plato, the soul predates the body, and the soul will survive indefinitely after the death of the body. Right? When the body disappears, the soul still survives. Plato, in other words, doesn't view the body and soul as having that tight a relationship. Whereas for Aristotle, that's as crazy as saying that the bricks and the shape of the house into which the bricks are arranged, that they don't have such a tight relationship. But for Aristotle, of course they do. Of course they do. And ultimately, Plato has his view and he runs with it, and Aristotle runs in the complete other direction. Plato believes in reincarnation, where your soul could actually end up in different bodies. Aristotle compares that to the soul being able to animate even just obviously crazy inanimate objects like books. And that just can't happen, right? It just can't happen. Um, but Plato really firmly believes in reincarnation. He, in fact, believes that the soul can be independent of a human body and just exist in no body at all, or it can end up in the body of a bird or a cow or even a star. Aristotle, in the same chapters of De Anima that this episode of the Ancient Philosophy podcast is about, Aristotle disagrees very strongly. But on the other hand, there's the opposite view, which we might call materialism, which is the view that the soul is actually just another corporeal, material, physical thing. And many other ancient philosophers held this view, both before Plato and after Aristotle. So, one clear example of this would be the atomists. So I'll choose someone like Democritus, who's predating Aristotle. And Democritus believes that the soul is just made up of the same material things as everything else, atoms. The same things that compose a book and a computer, right, are atoms, and they make up the soul, and thus they explain why some things are alive and some things are not. What happens when you die? The relevant atoms are scattered, according to Democritus. And this is a view that people hold well after Aristotle too, like Epicurus. When we think about the soul today, we're most likely to believe in something that's literally, by definition, tied to immortality, tied to some kind of afterlife, tied to some sense of like the mysterious inner part of a person. And that's just not what ancient Greek philosophers mean when they talk about the soul. The fact that they don't mean that permits someone like Democritus and someone like Epicurus to believe that really souls are just atoms, and they're just atoms put together in a certain kind of way. You put together atoms one way, you get spaghetti. You put together atoms another way, you get a soul, and thus you get life when that thing is present in a body. But for Aristotle, that's also a complete mistake. It's a mistake in the other direction that Plato went in. So we have, on the one hand, Platonic dualism, which says that souls and bodies are so radically different that they actually don't even need each other. Meanwhile, on the other hand, you have atomists like Democritus and much later Epicurus, and they believe that souls and bodies are just actually fundamentally the same thing. And then you have Aristotle in the middle who's saying, no, no, souls and bodies are actually distinct things. Souls and bodies are actually distinct things, but they're distinct not in a way that lets them exist independently of each other. They're distinct not in a way that lets them exist independently of each other. Plato was onto something when he rejected his predecessors and their materialism, which again is the view that that souls are just fundamentally material things, just as corporeal things are. And Plato was onto something, but he misunderstood just how tight the relationship between souls and bodies actually are. It's just not as tight as the materialists thought that it was. You need a certain kind of body for a soul to come to be and for a soul to stick around in. You change something relevant in the body, like you lose a lot of blood, and all of a sudden the right proportions can't be maintained. And so the soul vanishes because the form is no longer maintained. Just like if you removed enough things from a statue of a human being, it would cease to be a statue of a human being. Its form would change. Its form would change. And when the form of a living thing changes in the right sorts of ways, it's no longer a living thing. It's no longer a living thing. So that is Aristotle's view of what the afterlife is. In other words, there really isn't an afterlife for the soul because the soul can't exist separate from the body, even though souls aren't corporeal things. Just like the form or shape of a house isn't itself corporeal. Yes, it needed some kind of matter, a very specific kind of matter in which it can be instantiated, but but that doesn't make the form material itself. The matter is just that of which the house is made. So that concludes our look at Aristotle's theory of the soul. Of course, there are so many other topics we can talk about in this vicinity. For instance, we can say something about Aristotle's hylomorphism in general, why he believes it. We might also say something about perceptual souls and nutritive souls and intellectual souls. These are the different kind of souls that beings of different levels of complexity have. But those are really special topics in Aristotle's theory of the soul. Right now, it's important for us to have just bear in mind what we've talked about so far, which is that Aristotle thinks the soul is the first actuality of a body that has life potentially within it. And that rules out the separate existence of the soul that someone like Plato thought was so important. In this way, Aristotle's drawing out a very compelling theory of what makes something alive and what makes living things different from non-living things, even though it doesn't exactly engage with what our knee-jerk reactions to what souls are today, whether we believe in souls today or not. Still, we probably all have a sense that souls have something to do with the afterlife and the mysterious inner part of a person. But for Aristotle, it's really more about being the first actuality of a body that has life potentially within it, which means that it is what makes a body that has a certain level of complexity and a certain kind of structure such that it's possibly alive. The soul is what makes that thing actually alive. And that actuality brings with it a bunch of capacities that when we exercise them through, say, eating and other forms of nourishment or nutrition, or for us humans, that could be like intellectual activity, where when we activate those capacities, we've got second actualities. And that concludes really what Aristotle's view is, at least at this general level. In future episodes, we'll discuss some of the special topics that I mentioned earlier. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to subscribe, you can find more Ancient Philosophy podcast episodes and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts, such as Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I also have a Substack, which is Plato's fishtrap.substack.com. I also have a book available for purchase, An Introduction to the Ethics of Social Media, which you can buy wherever you buy books, such as Amazon or directly through the publisher, which is Hackett. Thanks for listening. I've been Doug Campbell, and this has been the Ancient Philosophy Podcast.